John Perry, thanks so much for coming back onto Evolution Soup all the way from your home in Montreal, Canada. Now, you're known for the hugely popular Stated Clearly YouTube channel, where you present your simple and easy to understand digital animations about science and evolution. You also run the Stated Casually channel, which you host and talk about science, as well as answer viewers' questions. And you've even used these as presentations at schools and colleges. Well, last time we talked about the coronavirus and how it evolves. So how have things been going for you, John? How has 2022 been treating you so far?
I'm happy to say that, COVID seems to be dying out over here in Montreal. My wife works at the hospital, and so she still deals with it every once in a while. She actually got exposed to it really heavily like 2 weeks ago, but no problems. We both had COVID already. So the, that plus vaccinations, she seems to be doing super awesome with being able to handle being exposed to it. But yeah, everything's opened up. It's so nice to have normal life returning. So that's how things are here. We've had a pretty normal summer. It's been awesome.
John, when we discuss evolution, the subject of mutation comes up a lot. It's been described as the engine that powers evolution and is currently being looked at in a new way thanks to some recent findings, which we'll explore later in this interview. So before we go any further, what are mutations and why are they so important for the process of evolution?
A mutation is just a change in the nucleotide sequence of an organism's genome. So the genome is the collection of all of the genes that an organism has. And a mutation is just a change in the nucleotide sequence of that genome. So the A's, C's, T's, and G's in your DNA, these different nucleotides. And you can have mutations that just swap out some nucleotides for other nucleotides. So it's kind of like an editing type mutation. You can have other mutations called insertions or deletions, which either expand the length of a genome, the overall information content of a genome, or contract that information content. So you can have deletions. And these are caused by all sorts of things. You can have solar radiation can cause mutations. So DNA damage, when your DNA is damaged and your cells then try to repair it, they can repair it wrong. they can screw up in the repair, and the sequence will be changed. That's how a lot of point mutations happen. You can have a virus can infect you and insert genes into your genome. That's a type of viral induced mutation, and that can be a pretty huge mutation. You get an entire virus genome inserted into your genome. We have what are called jumping genes. Most of these seem to have come from viruses in the past. They came from viral infections. And some of these virus genes are still intact and functional, and they can actually cause chunks of a genome to move to other parts of the genome. So you get things that just shuffle around. Genes will shuffle around over evolutionary time. We're talking over millions of years. This can happen. So pretty much any type of modification to the genome you can imagine, we've observed happening, either in laboratory experiments or we've deduced from looking at the genomes of different animals and organisms, or a single population that has different individuals with different mutations that have happened. We've been able to piece together how those mutations work. So there's a whole diverse array of mutation types and mutation causes. But the end result of these mutations is, you could say, is largely random. I mean, there's no planning happening. We don't decide to mutate in a specific way. What happens is you have mutation, and then after mutation occurs, natural selection can either promote or demote that mutation. It can either select against it or favor it in a population, and so that mutation will spread if it happens to be beneficial. It'll be deleted eventually within a population if it's not beneficial, if it's negative. If it's a neutral mutation, it might stick around for a long time, maybe indefinitely.
Which is why we have such weird-looking species on the planet, isn't it? That we don't all have this sort of uniform look. We have giraffes with long necks, and we have jellyfish who look really weird, and it's because of what's going on behind the scenes, isn't it?
Right. You can think of mutation as just like the clay being added to the sculpture. Natural selection is sculpting things away, cutting things off as new clay is being added. That's one analogy that has been pretty popular. But we're constantly experiencing mutations. There's about 100 mutations per generation, per person. Oh. And those are either being favored or disfavored by natural selection. And it's this constant process of descent with modification acted upon by natural selection that's shaping what we are. And that's happening with all different organisms. I mean, different organisms mutate at different rates, but it's the bread and butter of evolution, the mutations.
It makes me wonder, listening, John, to what you're saying, is that if we rewound the clock back to the beginning of time and let life begin again, it would look completely different by the time it got to where we are now, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, assuming that we're not, 100% determinism, right? Well, assuming that we're, if you were to just take a simple prokaryote, single-celled eukaryotic animal or organism, and plant it on some planet somewhere, it's not necessarily gonna eventually produce humans or anything like mammals or tetrapods or anything.
Yeah, that's the Star Trek.
It can go anywhere.
Outlook.
Right. Yeah. Star Trek is not a very accurate in their biology. So yeah.
Well, despite the overwhelming evidence for the evolutionary process, not least of all the DNA evidence we have, there are still critics out there who say that mutations don't add any new information to an organism. In other words, they do more harm than good. So what does the actual data say?
A lot of times when people talk about mutations, a lot of times we're talking about point mutations, and that's where you have a single nucleotide that's switched out with some other nucleotide. And that's a way that genetic information is edited, you could say. But we also have mutations where entire genes are duplicated. We have insertions, we have deletions. So a chain of DNA, that the information content and DNA, it can be expanded, it can be shrunken, it can be edited. So all of these things are possible through mutations of different types. Anything is possible. And one of the really important types of mutations that have happened, when you look at different genomes of different species, we see a lot of gene duplications. So one gene that was doing one function is duplicated through a duplication mutation. And after that happens, it will undergo mutations. And this is over millions of years, lots of descent with modification. And you can actually get a gene that had one function, it's duplicated, and then one of those genes ends up taking on a second function. And this is how we get a lot of innovation to happen over the course of evolution, because these starting genes, they already had a function, so they're already, fairly complex structures, and little small tweaks can change the functions of those genes. And one of my animations goes over this. So I have a 2-part series on the Stated Clearly channel about new genetic information. And one of those is about point mutations. The other one is about gene duplications and the sorts of innovations that those can cause. And there's all sorts of amazing innovations that can happen with the interplay between point mutations and gene duplications, and I go over some really strong and really well understood case studies in that in those animations.
And one of the ones I think of is the fact that some of us, or a lot of us, can digest milk, meaning like cow's milk, which we, a few, tens of thousands of years ago, weren't able to do.
Right. Yeah. So there's quite a few little mutations in humans that make different populations adapted to certain, traits in their environment or challenges in their environment. When we were domesticating livestock, some populations mutated and gained the ability to continue digesting milk, that lactose, all throughout their life. So everyone has this ability when they're babies, right? That's what we consume, is we consume milk. But for most of us, that ability turns off. For most humans, that ability turns off. And there's a mutation that changed how genes were expressed so that certain populations can digest milk indefinitely. And this happened in European ancestry. A couple of other, I think it actually happened, I'd have to look at the data again, but I'm pretty sure that happened independently and in different ways in different populations. But yeah, there are many examples of mutations in humans that allow us to just have slightly different phenotypes, and those let us survive in slightly different environments, different selection pressures. And that's one that I can digest milk just fine. Most other Europeans can. And it's done us a lot of good because we had those cows and other milk producing animals that we were living with, and it allowed us to exploit.
And a lot of people are still lactose intolerant, as we know when we go to our supermarket and go down that aisle.
Yeah, and certain lineages are very have a lot more lactose intolerance than other lineages, and that's because that mutation happened in specific lineages only, and it's since spread. So I want to say that a lot of Asian populations tend not to be lactose tolerant, but because there's been mixing of populations since forever, that mutation has spread over into Asian populations, and so far as there's selection pressure for it, it's going to spread really far into any population. So,
mutation. It is the key to our evolution. It has enabled us to evolve from a single-celled organism into the dominant species on the planet. This process is slow, normally taking thousands and thousands of years. But every few hundred millennia, evolution leaps forward.
Well, when people first hear the word mutation, it's not necessarily in science class. It's more likely to be heard during a trip to the cinema. Now, mutations have been used as a plot device for science fiction films going right back to the 50s, when we had a whole slew of giant bug movies. And in more modern times, we hear about them in films like X-Men, based, of course, on the Marvel Comics. So let's concentrate on the X-Men, the team of extraordinary human beings who all possess the so-called X gene, a mutation that allows them to do everything from controlling the weather to vanishing into thin air. So did Marvel get mutations right, or, I don't know, only partly right?
Yeah, I would say partly right, but you got to be fairly charitable. I mean, one thing that Marvel did is it got a lot of people interested in mutations and biology and evolution. So I'm not one of these people who gets upset when science fiction, or I don't even know if you would call this science fiction. They're not even trying to be accurate at all, really. But there's a couple of things that are deeply wrong with this idea of the X gene. That's what it's called, right? The X gene. With the X gene, you've got one gene, they're saying, that causes any superhero power, from, like you said, controlling the weather to, being pretty much invincible like Wolverine is. That really makes no sense. I mean, I guess if you were to try and compare that to something in biology, you could say human intelligence might be something similar to that, and that human intelligence, it gave us extreme plasticity of the mind. So you can do almost anything with your mind, right?
Mhm.
You can learn to read, or you can learn to control fire, or, because you have this beautiful brain that can do all sorts of different things and be applied to a bunch of different circumstances. So I guess that's the closest that I would say you could get to sort of an X gene, right? As you develop a structure that is capable of lots of different things and can be applied to lots of different problems. But the other big issue with the X gene here is that, like you mentioned, it's happening to individuals. Individuals have entire, complete, really complex adaptations that they developed in a single step. That is just not possible. If you look at any of our really complicated adaptations, so if you look at the eye or the ears, like how does it we hear? This is a really interesting adaptation to look at. Our ability to hear, we have these little hair, people call them hair cells inside of our ear that are sensing vibrations in the liquid inside of our inner ear. Those, you can trace those all the way back to fish. If you ever catch trout, you notice that they have this kind of a line along their side that's kind of greasy inside. If you've eaten a trout, and you can separate the meat on this little line that divides their body. That line is inside of it. It's got these little hair cells that are sensing vibrations and sensing pressure. That's where our ears evolved from. Our ears evolved from these hair cells that fish had originally to sense pressure differences in the water, and they would get a sort of a primitive sound and hearing from that as well. They're sensing pressure differences, and we're doing the exact same thing with the same cell types inside of our ears. We're sensing pressure differences, really, really distinct pressure differences that come from sounds hitting our ear. But it is this same system that has been slowly adapted over millions and millions and millions of years to give us the adaptation of hearing that we have today. So you don't get a complex trait like hearing in a single mutation. And that's what we're seeing in these movies. You get these really complicated traits in a single mutation, and that is just not how evolution works. You have to have populations where multiple mutations can happen to build these complex traits. Now, there are simple traits that could evolve in a single mutation. I'm trying to think of an example. We have one really vivid example is in snails. You can have the way that a snail's shell spirals. That can be shifted in a single point mutation. There happens to be a single point mutation that can cause the spiraling of a snail's shell to completely switch direction. And that can have really important consequences in a snail's life, because in order for them to find a mate, that can kind of screw up with who they can mate with. It can be really hard to mate with a snail with the opposite spiral in their shell. It can also make it so that they can survive attacks from certain predators, because there are certain predators that have evolved to eat snails that only have a certain spiral. Like there are snakes, for example, that have a curved face for eating snails. And if you have a snail that has a mutation that causes a difference in the spiral, well, those snakes now have trouble eating them. And so this can be a survival adaptation, but at the same time, it causes a problem for them because it's harder for them to mate with other snails. Yeah. So there's this
double-edged sword.
Yeah, double-edged sword there. A lot of times you'll hear people say that evolution doesn't happen to individuals. It happens to, it's a population phenomenon, right? Populations evolve, individuals do not. Now, individual novel traits, those do pop up in individuals, but most adaptations, things that we actually consider interesting adaptations, they are sophisticated. There's multiple mutations involved in those adaptations, and they require long chains of descent with modification acted upon by natural selection. And so they require populations in order to evolve, populations of organisms that are reproducing. There will be one mutation that's really beneficial, and that will pop up in a single individual that will start spreading through a population. And then another mutation will pop up somewhere else, and those will meet together in one individual, again, in one individual. And it will make the adaptation even better than it was before. And so you have this building up of complex adaptations through descent with modification acted upon by selection in a population of organisms over evolutionary time. There's a really cool experiment with bacteria called the long-term evolutionary experiment. And what they've done is they've just been watching bacteria evolve in petri dishes.
Isn't it?
Yeah, the Lenski experiment. So they've been doing this for over 20 years now, and they've seen some really neat adaptations evolve in these populations. And what they found is that there are what they've called potentiating mutations. And this is a mutation where I guess you could kind of say that it's similar to the X gene, and that it causes a potential in a population to do something really cool. And so you have an invisible potential within a population to start doing something really cool. And then you'll have different individuals in that population undergo, by chance, a mutation that pushes them over the edge into doing something that's actually interesting. So this is kind of like the X gene in X-Men, except for it's not like everyone's doing something dramatically different. It's not like some of these bacteria can control the weather all of a sudden, while others can control fire, right? Yeah. In the case of the Lenski experiment, the ability that they were gaining was the ability to process citrate, which was a type of food that was available to them in their environment, but the wild type microbes didn't have the ability to consume this food, not under the aerobic conditions of the environment. So there was a potentiating mutation in one population of bacteria in this experiment that primed all of the individuals of that population to easily undergo a second mutation that would allow them to actually start eating this new food source. And because they were all primed by an invisible mutation, something that natural selection was not favoring or disfavoring, it was a neutral mutation as far as natural selection is concerned, but it primed them to be able to have a second mutation that would allow them to start eating this new food source. And so you have individuals undergoing this second mutation, and so poof, over here, all of a sudden you get this ability to eat this food. And then over here in the population, poof, you also get the ability to eat this food independently. And you have this sort of similar to the X gene, right? That is one way that you can get real biology to sort of do what we see in the X-Men, right? And then after you have this initial, so you have a potentiating mutation, then you have what they call the actualization mutation, which is that first mutation that allows them to start eating this food. And there are multiple different mutations that can cause that. And then from there, you get refinement mutations. So over many generations, this ability is refined and perfected until you get really efficient abilities to consume this new food source. And it's really neat in the experiments because what they did in these experiments is every generation, they would take a small chunk of the population, just a little bit of the solution, and they would freeze it. I don't know if it was every generation, but it was every certain number of generations, they would freeze a sample that they could then revive these bacteria. You can freeze them and then thaw them, and they're alive. So they had a historical record of basically every step in the evolution of this ability to consume citrate. And because of that, they found this amazing ability in one population, and they were able to go back in time and see how that evolved. And they discovered all these different steps in the evolution of that. And some of those steps were actually invisible to natural selection. They were potentiating steps. And that's, I guess you could say that's similar to the X gene, right? There's another way that you could get something similar to what we see in X-Men, where you see an amazing ability pop up independently in different individuals within a population. So it's not necessarily inherited directly from the parents. It's just popping up kind of randomly in a population. And that is through the independent assortment of parental traits that happen to form a unique trait in the offspring. One example of this is, height. The height of a human is determined by multiple different genes. There are many genes that control height. Just to keep things simple, we could say that there are 5 genes that control height. You can have, each person has a different allele. You can have a short allele for each one of those genes. So there's 5 genes, and then there's 2 different versions for each of those genes. There's a short version and there's a tall version. We call these different versions of a gene, we call these alleles. So maybe you have a mother with 3 tall alleles and 2 short alleles. So she's got 5 total genes that are controlling her height. 3 of them are tall, 2 of them are short. And the husband has 2 tall alleles and 3 short alleles, and they're different, so that they contrast with the mother. Well, when they get together and have children, some of those children will have some of the father's short alleles, and some of the mother's short alleles, and some of the father's tall alleles, and some of the mother's tall alleles. One of them might happen to just be dealt the perfect deck of cards where they get all of the tall alleles at once, and so they're freakishly tall, right? And that can happen randomly through this random assortment, the dealing of cards. You could think of it this way. And in another lineage, another family within that population, you could get some kid who also gets dealt the perfect hand, and so he's freakishly tall. And so when you have a trait that's controlled by multiple genes, you can get the sudden appearance in different lineages of an extraordinary trait because you happen to have been dealt an extraordinary hand of cards, and in this independent assortment of genes that happens in sexually reproducing organisms. So that's another way that you could get something like the X gene, where it pops up randomly in a population. If that trait happens to be advantageous, these tall kids end up being more successful than other members of the population. A lot of their offspring they might end up being short because they're going to be mating with other people that have a mixture of alleles. And so you can get sort of a, the offspring are going to be short and when they're mixing with other individuals. But if being tall is beneficial, what you're going to get is people who have some of those tall alleles are going to be selected for. And you're going to get, what will eventually happen is you'll get the funneling of all of these tall alleles into one lineage that is 100% tall alleles. So natural selection can funnel these alleles that exist all over the population into one lineage, and suddenly you get a purely tall population. That will happen over evolutionary time, this funneling effect that happens. And you get that when natural selection is favoring a specific trait. So it pops up independently at first, randomly here and there, and then it starts becoming more and more common as short people are weeded out in favor of tall people. And then you get an entire population of tall people. In the X-Men, we have the sudden appearance of new special adaptations, right? And we really, as I mentioned before, complex adaptations, they take a long time to evolve, but there are adaptations that we've seen that a lot of people would consider to be complex that we've just seen happen in real time as we've been domesticating dogs, for example. There's a really neat breed called the Norwegian Lunhund, which was bred for hunting cave birds on the seashore. So it was like, I can't remember the type of bird it was, but there are birds that nest in these little tiny caves in along the coast. And these dogs were bred to just go in these little tiny caves and pull out these birds, hunt them that way. And the people who were selectively breeding these dogs, all they cared about is this dog good at collecting birds for me? If so, I'm going to keep this dog and make sure that he has lots of babies because I want puppies that can also catch birds really well. And in that process of just selecting for dogs that can really hunt these birds efficiently, they ended up selecting for the ability of these dogs to pinch their ears closed. So there are normal muscles in the ears of dogs that let them move their ears around.
Yeah.
And in the Lunhund, these are moved in the ear slightly. They're just positioned strange. It allows them to actually pinch their ear closed. And then so dirt and things can't fall into it, giving them ear infections and so on, plugging up their ears and affecting their hearing while they're hunting. They can plug their ears when stuff is starting to fall on their heads. They plug their ears and they can still have a little hole open in the ear that's kind of facing forward, and they can move that around like a periscope. So they can still hear, they can still use their hearing when they're hunting in these caves, but they prevent stuff from falling inside their ears and clogging up and ruining their hearing.
So the owners would have seen a couple of these animals with that sort of thing happening and put them together.
I don't think so. There's no history of them trying to cause that to happen at all.
Oh,
all they cared about was, I want the dog that can hunt really well. And just by selecting for good hunting skills, you see this really weird adaptation in the Norwegian Lunhund. They have a bunch of other adaptations. They're incredibly flexible. So they can bend their head all the way back and touch their own back with it, which is useful for navigating these really tight caves. They have extra toes. They've got I think you call it polydactyl. They have 6 toes, and they can sprawl their toes really wide, which helps them for climbing around in these crazy rocks. There's a whole bunch of really unique adaptations that these dogs have for hunting in these caves, and that was just selecting for good hunting skills. So these mutations are happening. Selection is happening. In this case, they were just selecting for good hunting skills, and you get the merging of all these different traits, these slight tweaks to the normal phenotype of a dog, and you get these amazing new features, that really novel abilities that these dogs have. It's really, really fascinating to see.
And so what about this new discovery that was published right back at the beginning of this year? It seems that mutations aren't quite as random as we once thought. Isn't that right?
When you look at evolutionary biologists talking about the random nature of mutation, they haven't been talking about mutations being perfectly random, and that a mutation can happen exactly anywhere in the genome. We've known for a very long time that there are certain parts of an organism's genome that are more vulnerable to mutation than other parts. There are certain types of mutations that happen easier than other types of mutations. And this is a consequence of DNA being a physical thing in the physical world. A cell is a physical thing in the physical world. So you just think of a cell, and the DNA is all clustered up inside that cell. There are parts of the DNA that are going to be safer than other parts because they're more, they're deeper inside the cell. They're just shielded better from the craziness of the outside world, right? So we've known for a very long time that there's a difference in mutation rate across the genome. One question that scientists have had for a long time is, is natural selection able to exploit that? Or do genes that are really important, genes that would be really easy to break and be devastating if they were to break, is it possible that those end up over evolutionary time, that those end up in the safest parts of a cell, that they are the most protected inside of a cell, whereas other genes that are less important end up being placed in sections of the genome that are more vulnerable to mutation? And what we found is that the answer is yes. In Arabidopsis thaliana, which is this plant that's really well studied in biology. It's the model plant that everyone studies because it grows so easily in the lab. This plant's genome has been extensively studied, and what we find is that its essential genes, so the genes that are doing really important, just basic housekeeping inside the cell, genes that are essential for keeping just individual cells going, those essential genes that can be ruined by a single point mutation in some cases, they are highly, highly protected compared to other genes in the genome. And they exist in locations that are safest. And also they are allotted more resources by the cell for repair. So we have these enzymes, these repair enzymes that exist inside of our cells. When a mutation occurs, when a chunk of DNA is broken through radiation or some other cause, these enzymes will run over the gene and try to fix it. And there's a bunch more of these enzymes located around these essential genes than there are located around other genes in the genome. And this is just over evolutionary time. It's kind of a meta adaptation. It's like learning how to learn, right? It's the evolution of evolvability. Our genomes have evolved the ability to take extra care of really important genes and let other genes mutate more randomly, I guess you could say. So some people want to say that this is an example of non-random mutation. Still, when mutations happen, it's happening randomly. I mean, the cell is not deciding what type of mutation it wants to have next. That's a really common misconception when people read this paper or hear about this paper. They think that the cell is deciding its own evolutionary future. That is not the case. What's happening here is that the cell has evolved the ability to protect more efficiently the genes that it really needs for its basic cellular functions. And so what we see when we look at that is that it's allowing other genes to mutate faster.
It's still natural selection, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. It's just normal evolution, normal natural selection that has produced this ability. It's a meta adaptation. It's an adaptation that allows a gene to better handle its own genes. It allows a genome to better handle its own genes. So it kind of feels more special, more magical, but it's a normal adaptation. It's descent with modification acted upon by selection that allows this to happen.
We as human beings, we always sort of we see agency where it doesn't actually exist, because we're used to we are human beings and we're agents who decide things. It doesn't mean that everything else is deciding things, as you say.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, we talk about agents in biology. So basically anything that can make a decision, biologists will call agents. You'll even hear people talk about, you'll hear Dawkins talk about genes as being agents over evolutionary time, because a gene can evolve this way or that way, depending on selection pressures and so on. But that type of agency is very different than what you and I would think of. These genes are not deciding things the way that humans decide things. The way that the vocabulary is developed within the field of evolutionary biology, sometimes it can be confusing. Sometimes it can cause people to misinterpret studies and kind of project this woo-woo mysticism on top of biology. There's also a temptation for people to want to do that anyways. People, it kind of makes us feel more special about ourselves, about what life is up to when you have that sort of agency and free will applied to biology. There's a guy who came up with the idea, a term called natural genetic engineering, and he uses this to describe any sort of enzyme-induced mutation. So mutations can be induced by the environment through things like radiation, through all sorts of just nasty chemicals, right? But also you can have evolved enzymes that cause mutations to happen. So a virus has these enzymes that it uses to insert its genes into its host's genome. And he wants to call that natural genetic engineering. And that term, you can see that term being useful in ways because, we have enzymes that have evolved, and they've evolved the ability to edit genomes, right? Edit nucleotide sequences, but they're not doing this with any sort of understanding, right? They're just interacting with nucleotides. So it's that term was dramatically misinterpreted by the public, and it's fallen out of favor among biologists to talk about these enzymes that way. But people have these types of confusions, and it's understandable.
Well, we may not see superheroes wielding mutant powers in our cities anytime soon, but what about this new discovery? Is there any possibility that we can use this knowledge to, I don't know, cure a few diseases?
I mean, anytime we learn something new about how our genomes work, that could be useful medically. There are lots of genetic diseases that we deal with. Cancer is a disease caused by mutations that happen in your body cells during your lifetime. So the mutations that we talk about in evolutionary time that are important for evolution, those are mutations that happen in the germ line, so that happen in sperm cells or egg cells. But every single one of your cells has its own copy of your genome, and those cells can mutate. And one of the consequences of those cells mutating can be cancer, right? So it's not clear yet how this new information could be used to help us better understand cancer or genetic disease, but it's certainly possible. Every time we learn something new about the genome, it can be used in surprising new ways in medicine. So it's promising. It's always good to learn something new about how evolution works and about how the genome functions.
So, John, people will probably have noticed that you haven't posted on the Stated Clearly channel very recently. So how's everything going with that? And can we expect anything new soon?
Yeah, so recently I've just been doing a lot of client work just for, financial reasons. Stated Clearly doesn't really pay super well in general. But so I've been doing a lot of client work lately. Haven't done a whole lot of animations on there, but I have been working on one with Oxford, and that's going to be published really soon. It's about genetic conflict. So our genes can actually, we generally think of our genes as being in cooperation with each other, right? That your genes cooperated to build you. That's a very intense form of cooperation, but things are not as pretty as they might seem from the outside looking in. There's a lot of conflict in the genome. And so this animation is about that. It's called Genetic Conflict and the Parliament of Genes. So it talks about how conflict arises and how conflicts are settled over evolutionary time within our genomes. And I'm very excited about it. It's going to be more of a complex topic than I usually tackle on that channel, but I'm really loving how this animation is coming along. So
wow, really looking forward to that.
Yeah, that could be in the next couple of weeks. Kind of depends on. I'm working with Oxford, and they've actually they're a client that they funded this one, and so I'm doing a lot of back and forth with them. So it could be within the next 2 weeks to a month that'll be published.
Okay, John, thanks so much for coming back onto the show. I will leave links to your YouTube channel, Stated Clearly, as well as its sister channel, Stated Casually, in the description below, plus, of course, all your social media links. And all that's left to say is thank you once again for helping us all to stay curious.
Oh, well, thank you for having me on. This is great. It's always fun to be on here.